and that you can share it with your teams as well. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you. Hello. Well, I'm going to turn my camera off at this point. And as you can see, we are about to start. So thanks again, Karen. We can move on to the next slide. Karen's already done an acknowledgement, and so we do understand that you're all on different areas of country, so we acknowledge wherever you are. So we're going to start today by looking at this quote, which is from the Outdoor Play Space Naturally for Children Birth to 5 Years, where Sue Elliott, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, was the editor. So I will read this out so that if some people just end up listening, they will be knowing what the quote was. In a country where the outdoor lifestyle of bush and beach is iconic, it is a paradox that the next generation is increasingly cooped up indoors or playing in synthetic outdoor play spaces, where there is not a tree to climb, a cicada nymph shell to discover, or a mud pie to be moulded. I ask, is this what we want for our children? And we are sure that you will say no, it's not what we want for our children. And I have actually heard of stories of people that have observed children reaching through early childhood setting fences to get leaves or grab something natural. And that's pretty sad if there's not one item within the playground that it may end up being so synthetic that there's nothing natural for children. So before we get started, it's important to look at some historical perspectives and cover some foundations in why planning for outdoor play is important. So let's look at the next slide. So historical perspectives as influences on the importance of outdoor play. We can look back at educational theorists such as Rousseau, Froebel, Steiner, and that's going back to 18th, 19th, right through to the 20th century. And all of these theorists promoted nature in children's education. And Froebel's background was in forestry, and that led to child-led nature-based experiences as the core of his work. And Froebel, he looked to nature to provide learning resources. And Steiner, who I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, brought together values to honour and protect the wonder of childhood. And this supported the development of risk-taking. And for children in their philosophies, of the Steiner philosophies, children were encouraged to push themselves in play in nature kindergartens with a slow pacing within the daily visited spaces. So there's also significant life experiences from researchers, Tanner, Chawler. There's some that we've drawn on in early childhood education, but these are adults that have been looking back to childhood and direct experiences with nature, and the role of significant adults are critical. So this is why we can look back in history and get an understanding where the importance of outdoor play came from. Next, thanks, Karen. So there are other influences, and we're sure you will have heard of Reggio Emilia and environment as the third teacher, also forest schools and Australian folklore foundations in the bush. We've also got Dreamtime stories that come from Indigenous perspectives. We've got a really big rise of bush and beach kindergarten programs, particularly in Victoria, I'm aware of. And, of course, education for environmental sustainability, something very close to Bron's heart. So we need to clarify the role of Reggio Emilia as an influence too, because I do hear people say we do Reggio here, but it's also important to remember that Reggio Emilia is actually a city. It's a city in northern Victoria, and I asked you to reflect on, can we really do Reggio here, or is it that we are inspired by Reggio and the values and the way they've influenced us? I say that to you in making a question whether you're doing Reggio or using some of the key influences that you might, and inspirations from them. I remember a lecturer that I had way back in the 70s, someone very familiar, I'm sure, to you, named Rosemary Milne. She sadly passed away now, but Rosemary Milne wrote Marketing Play, a great book if you can get your hands on it. But she was also the writer of the lyrics, "There's a bear in there," for ABC, Play School. And I remember Rosemary saying once at a conference that why in Australia do we always look towards international programs and influences when we have some amazing programs unique to us here in Australia? And I think that's food for thought. We can be inspired by Reggio, and we can certainly use the philosophy values of environment as the third teacher, but why not think about the ways you do things yourself in the context of your own community and settings to make Australian practices be on the world map? So I think that's worth thinking about too. And Malaguzzi was one of the leaders of the reforms for Reggio services that were established in 1964. So just give some thought to that. Do you do Reggio, or are you just inspired by using some of their practices? Because we need to make practices our own in Australia as well. Next, thank you. So what does research also tell us? Well, there's concerns re nature deficit. We hear about time for play, that it's being eroded, particularly during times of technology taking over, and you'll hear many families talk about that. Access to outside play is often being evaporated, and we also have a risk-aversion society where you hear of people saying parents sometimes are the helicopter parents, hovering over their children, fear of accidents, or wrapping their children up in cotton wool. And nature connections are therefore under threat. There's a quote I'd like to also share with you from Karen Martin, who did a literature review on putting nature back into nurture, and the benefits of nature for children were part of her journal article. And she talked about environments needing to contain natural elements such as rocks, trees, water, and to provide, in the ways they provide people with unique and unrivalled mentally restorative settings. I'm sure as we come out of COVID, many of you will be very conscious of that and how we make sure that our young children have restorative settings and less stress in their lives. And it's evident from international research that nature contact is associated with positive physical and mental health for adults. And increasing evidence indicates that children also benefit from contact with nature, as it supports that personal and social development, as well as mental and physical health. I'm sure if you're like me, if I walk into a bush setting or through a beautiful green space park, you virtually feel yourself just calming down and relaxing straight away. And whenever adults are invited to share childhood memories, if I've run workshops for Play Australia, or even asking students, they often describe outdoor experiences as their most memorable play experiences. And they can include exciting games they've played and social interaction, the fantasies that they've imagined or discoveries they've made while exploring, the opportunities they've had for independence. And you often hear people say they only used to come home from their local neighbourhood for lunch or dinner and were able to stay outside for ages. So we can think back to the experiences we've had and compare them with what research is telling us now about time for play being eroded. Let's move on. Thanks. So it's always important to think about philosophy for any early childhood topic that we talk about. And the philosophy is important because that's about us ensuring that we reflect our values and what's important to us in early childhood in our practice. And it should include voices of all children, the staff and the families we work with. So I just leave you with a reflective question there in thinking about your own settings and what your philosophy values might look like. And it is important for all staff to be very aware and have a unified belief in what's important. I've asked staff in some services before about what their centre philosophy is, and I've had people say, oh, have we actually got one on the wall anywhere? Where is it? Now, regulatory requirements ask that you do have a centre philosophy displayed, so it's important to regularly look at it and as a staff team think about, what does it look like in practice? Does everyone have a clear understanding? And so perhaps you have the value of outdoor play reflected in your philosophy, but I ask, is it lived out? Is it of high importance to all educators, or is there far more time devoted to indoor play? So it is really important to make sure all staff are reflecting the centre philosophy. And maybe you could ask, is there enough time devoted to outdoor play? Is there enough time devoted to planning curriculum in the outdoors together with inviting play spaces that will engage children? Or does staff devote most of their time only to indoor planning? So these are really important things to think about to make sure outdoor play has equivalence in relation to part of the philosophy values. Let's move on. So I'll leave you with that message. Consider your own philosophy values and why they are important to you, because as educators we need to be able to articulate that to the families we work with and why we're valuing outdoor play, and to know the benefits of it, to be able to talk about it perhaps in newsletters, when you're greeting and farewelling parents, and you can talk about some of the values the children have had while they've been involved in any outdoor play. So it's not about just documenting something on the wall or a brochure, but it's about living out real everyday practices that show the value of the outdoor play and the learning that's occurring. Next slide. So we've got guiding documents. We've got the National Quality Frameworks, we've got the Early Years Learning Framework and also the Victorian Early Years Learning and Development Framework. And it's important that you are familiar with the ways they guide us in relation to planning outdoor play spaces. Children are connected with and contribute to their world is outcome 2, and children become socially responsible and show respect for the environment. So therefore it is important that educators equip themselves with the knowledge and tools to promote learning in learning outcome 2, for example. We've also got the national quality standards that have 1.1, 3.1.3, the numbers don't matter, but they also portray implementation of the frameworks that may include examples of children expressing wonder and interest in their environments. They refer to outdoor spaces in needing to include natural elements and materials to allow multiple uses for children, and that the service takes an active role in caring for its environment and contributes to a sustainable future. And if we look at the Victorian Early Years Learning and Development Framework, we've also particularly got Indigenous perspectives that come through in that document. So use them and make sure that staff know how they do guide our work in relation to planning outdoor spaces. Let's move on. So it's interesting to look back too that the Children's Services regulations in Victoria changed way back in 2009, that the outdoor space provided at a children's service must include features that enable the children to explore and experience the natural environment. That outdoor spaces include a range of different natural features such as sand, soil, grass, and a variety of different plantings and trees, and allowing children to touch and interact with the natural environment in their everyday play. So there's no excuse not to be ensuring that your services do reflect these really important elements. Let's move to the next. I also love to think back to some well-known, inspiring educators that have given us messages, and Jim Greenman is one who's sadly passed away now. He's written some wonderful publications, and he reminded us that the environment is more than the physical setting. It includes people, time, space, and the way these are utilised. So again, this is a really important point to take away from today. People, time and space, and the importance of his message. Let's move on. So spaces also should excite all the senses. That's one message I think that you should think about too, and engage all 5 senses. Learning environments that can include both indoor and outdoor spaces and resources, they can be an extension of each other. These are photographs I've taken at early childhood settings before. Yarn bombing, it was around a pole where children had been involved in a setting. The bottom photo again, just a really inviting play space set up by an educator. And you can see how those spaces say, you know, come and get me, come and play outside. This is an inviting, inspiring place to be in. So we need to also consider indoor-outdoor programs and how relaxed they might be, that you can think about, can children go and flow from indoors to outdoors? Is it planned for? Is it possible? I remember I worked at one of my kindergartens in a really difficult building where there was a long passageway to go down and then to go out into the playground outside, because it was a church premises, so it wasn't designed specifically for indoor-outdoor play. But it was challenging to run an indoor-outdoor program, but we got walkie-talkies to communicate together with staff, and you know, we did manage to do it. And when you want to think about changes, maybe sometimes it's about brainstorming together what might be possible. But an indoor-outdoor program allows children to play, you know, where they choose. So having responsive environments that suit the age and stage and the children that you're working with. And by having environments like this, they will support the children through routines and materials and interactions that occur. So think about when your best teaching moment might have been. And I'm going to ask that question of Bron for a minute so I can have a rest from talking. Bron, what might have been a really significant teaching moment that you might have had where you think about your spaces outside? Anything come to mind?
Absolutely. I think some of the challenges that you were talking about, that it's not always naturally an integrated space. sometimes you do have to think outside the box a little bit, and also let children lead you. So they often have lots of wonderfully amazing ideas. And I think that we need to be tuning into the voices of little people and see what imagination and what they can use and what experiences they might have from home that they can also bring in. It doesn't always have to be led by us, which is probably one of the most important things. I know recently, and I think I just shared that with Karen and Anne earlier in the week because it was a bit of a highlight of my teaching week. We've recently just got chickens, and it wasn't something that we decided to do just because we needed chickens. We were gifted eggs, and we received 4 hens and a rooster. The rooster's living at my house. It's not something that can live in the kindergarten, unfortunately. And the chickens are actually part of our space. So they are actually now coming out into the environment because they were invited by children. And it's very common in the last 2 days to see Princess Buttercup come and sit on the mat with the children in one of our spaces. I'm lucky to teach across 2 educational spaces and the chickens in our other space because we shared the chickens. We have our first egg, which we take as an indicator that children and educators are obviously working really well to make sure that our chickens are healthy, but we've been able to communicate across those spaces too. So I think the opportunities for outdoor isn't just activity or experience based. It can also be life skill development as well if we think about it really holistically and push ourselves to be challenged a little bit. Not everybody knew about chickens, so it is very much from an educator's perspective that we did have to do quite a bit of learning ourselves and become comfortable with having animal friends as part of our team. We have a CLAW team, a children's learning and animal welfare team. So that's just something this year that we've taken on that has certainly benefited children, but also a lovely opportunity for educators. And children actually now sit next to the chicken coop if the chickens aren't out and they believe they can talk chicken. So I think that maybe is a good example, Anne.
And you'll just need to unmute. You'll just need to unmute.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Bron. That's a great example, and that's a good point for me to actually say it's more than just a run outside, opening the doors and go for a run. That's a good point. I'd also like to mention dispositions of children. When we think about the extension of indoors to outdoors, I think sometimes people plan for children's interests, but they forget to think about planning in a holistic way, and you mentioned being holistic, in the way they might plan for a child's disposition. I'll use an example of where you might have a child that you start to realise really loves persistence, or they've got the disposition of being determined and they love a challenge. And the educator might say, oh, no, this child's really loving all the hard puzzles and they love the challenge of the puzzles. But if you look at that child's dispositions of loving to be pushed and extended in that way and being challenged, how might that disposition be reflected in the outdoors as well? And perhaps that's the child, because they love a challenge, needs to be challenged in their outdoor climbing, for example, where you think, right, I'm going to extend that disposition by planning for planks on, a higher rung of the A-frame, and really thinking about the child in terms of dispositions to plan outdoors as well. So it's not just based on their interests, but it's about really looking at the dispositions of the child to be looking in a holistic way of indoors and outdoors. Would you agree with that, Bron? That thought?
Absolutely. I think, that multiple intelligence too, Anne, where there's lots of different ways of learning and being. So, the children that might be, mathematically minded or really like to communicate, and there's no reason why we can't be planning those sorts of experiences outdoors as well as indoors. So all of those things do need to be considered across dispositions, ways of learning, across both the indoor and outdoor environment, almost like there are no walls or barriers.
Yes, that's a good point. So not seeing them as two completely separate sections. And this is what's concerning sometimes when you see that people devote so much time for setting up inspiring play spaces inside, but then perhaps less outside, because they deserve equal value, don't they?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think we worry about packing up outside for a multitude of reasons. Will things be stolen, or, you know, some of our resources may get wet, and so that makes it not as, you know, it's difficult to have paper outside if it's going to get wet. So maybe, you know, part of the planning for outdoors also needs to think about, well, how can we keep those resources in place so the play can continue? Because we also plan for that very well indoors, where we have that sort of evolution of learning. But if we're constantly setting up and starting from the same point every single day outdoors, it's hard then for children to be challenged to go to the next step or to take it in a different way. So, you know, I guess I always think about, if we've got baskets with natural resources, well, that's okay. They can be hooked on the fence. We don't have to be packing those away. Is it something as simple as like throwing a tarp over something because children are in the middle of doing something? And we're very mindful of that indoors. And I wonder if we give it as much thought outdoors for that sort of in-depth, you know, progressive learning that can only happen by giving time and day after day revisiting what they've been doing the day before.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask Karen to move to the next slide. Thank you. So it's time to start and look at some of the theories of play space arrangements, and it's important to think about what brain compatible learning environments look like, and to think about, when you're setting up play spaces, how do they engage all 5 senses, and do they ignite the senses of sight, sound, touch, taste and smell for children? And I think environments should say, you know, come and get me, come and play here, come and engage here. And we can think about that in the way we actually make spaces inviting. So let's look at some of the theories. Next slide. So these theories come again from Elliott as editor, and there's 4 theories here, you'll see, and it's about seeing planning as a landscape painting with 4 layers of complexity. We've got play space as a whole, so the overall aesthetic impression that's gained from the first viewing, and that's what I was meaning by needing to say, come and get me, come and play here, you know, and be inviting. And that's the backdrop for children's play. So it is not a backdrop in a static sense. It's dynamic and has, as such, impacts on program planning and children's play. And it needs to address, you know, the children's interests, of course, but also the dispositions of the children in your group. Layer 2, well-designed natural play spaces, and they provide a range of defined smaller areas variously referred to as enclosed spaces, dens, garden rooms or habitats within the overall space, and these provide foci for planning specific experiences. And then the 3rd layer is the loose materials and equipment that an adult or child might add to these spaces. So as you just said, Bron, you know, you might have something on the fence or some natural materials somewhere that are flexible in the ways children can use them. And these spaces constitute the planned and spontaneous play experiences that are the nuts and bolts of the program. And then we've got the 4th layer, which is the prevailing and seasonal weather conditions. So imagine looking out into a play space and being able to add another dimension to the program simply by looking at the weather conditions. So a well-designed environment is based on sensitive planning, focused on learning for the children and growing knowledgeable and supportive educators, because educators need to be intentional in understanding and knowing why they plan and design these spaces. There also needs to be respect for diverse cultures and languages of the children in your group, and contributions of children and family. You can gain input from children about what they may like and what families' contributions could be, even through donations of loose materials or equipment, and attention to the collected wisdom of researchers and practitioners. So, you do keep abreast of current research-based information. But accessible materials in the ways they are presented are important, and that they should also include movable items and structures and equipment. So all of this can help make really positive interactions and relationships for children, but also the adults working in them. So these are the 4 layers, and we'll look at those a bit deeper on the next slide. So number 1 was the play space as a whole. So that's about looking at design and arrangement. So consider placement of playground and equipment and ease of access. Ask yourself or have questions with staff. Are changes needed? How might loose materials and equipment enhance the space? This top photo was taken at Abbotsford Early Learning Centres. You can see way back in 2005 when I did a visit there. And I will always recall the conversation with the educator at the time, because I think somebody asked during the visit, what happens for children or parents? Don't they get concerned about if a child drops the rock or damages their big toe? And the educator explained they viewed it within their philosophical values as an opportunity for learning, where they could also be intentional to talk to children about, you're carrying a really big heavy rock, you'll need to be very careful. Maybe you might need to ask another child to help carry it and use 2 hands. So using it as a teaching strategy, but also seeing the value in the ways the children use those rocks. So you can see that from that photograph. That would have been, a long-term project, most likely, in how long it took for children to position all the rocks. But, that was part of their philosophy in the value of the loose materials and rocks. Whereas another centre might just have risk aversion and see all the dangers. So we need to be on the same page together as staff about what's acceptable and what's okay, and question the value and do risk benefit analysis in what might outweigh the negativity compared to the positive learning outcomes. So spare parts or loose materials can include things like these rocks or logs that might be moved around. The bottom photo I took at Glen Rowan Kindergarten some years back. And, these mean that we can make a really dynamic area in the outdoor play. But prop boxes for different materials might be something that you could have. And maybe you could have a outdoor shed policy, where the children can access the outdoor shed rather than keeping it closed. You may need to get in there and organise the shed and make it really safe for children to access. But prop boxes might have hoses and fireman caps and things like that, where children, as the time and in the moment, can go and access depending on the play that they are having. But loose materials and hay bales, tyres, boxes, planks of wood, wheels or logs are all items that can be manipulated by children to use in the way that suits their whatever's happening in their play. Let's move on to the next one. So number 2 is a well-designed natural play space, and you'll recall earlier we talked about regulatory aspects and how our guiding documents of the National Quality Standards and ELF and VELDF all make references to natural play spaces and materials. So we need to think about how we might have an area for an outside project where children might store something for Or as Bron said, if there's something ongoing and you don't want to pack it away on the day, is there a space, or maybe under a veranda where children can store something that if there is going to be a thunderstorm that night, but something they can access or easily continue the next day. Inclusive play spaces, making sure there's well-designed play spaces for small and active groups, and for encouraging interaction and relationship building. Private quiet spaces, multi-level areas where children can learn about balancing their body in space. You might even just need to take some pruning shears to a space and create a bit of a natural space by cutting away a few bushes, making a little hidey hole or a secret space for children. Toddlers and babies also need challenges. Some people think, a toddler area or a space for babies outside needs to be all a flat surface, but they too need to learn to manage their body and space. So perhaps having a step outside or some different levels where children can learn about balance, etc., and have mobility is really important. I'm just conscious of the time because we've got a bit to move through, so I'll move to the next slide. Thank you. So when we're creating natural play spaces, we're also providing opportunities for connecting with nature, and that allows you as educators to help promote positive attitudes and respect for the environment for children, where there's problem solving and social interaction. Children in this top photo were evidently modelling or imitating what they see adults do. It was a group of children I once observed huddled together on the ground in a camping ground. It wasn't an outdoor play space, but when they ran away, I went up to see what they'd been doing, and they'd used some loose sticks to recreate a fireplace, which there had been a fireplace in the camping ground. And this is inspiring to see children do such things when they've got opportunities for sticks and things. And some people might say, oh, we shouldn't have sticks, they're dangerous. But again, intentional teaching strategies in the ways children can use items, they can learn about safe play, and that will depend on the positive guidance as what you do as a teacher and the strategies. But think about how might you add natural materials within your play spaces, and do a bit of an audit, an assessment. Do you have enough? Could there be more in the way that you provide them for children? Do you need to bring nature in? And let's move on. Might just take a little bit of time because Karen's in the country with the internet connection, but we'll move to the next slide. Thank you. So another really important theory is about planning for unhurried and unstructured time, because children need the freedom to move from one activity to another. Oops, we've missed one more. They need to move. We'll go back to the time slide. They need to be able to have uninterrupted time to build a play situation. Thank you. And through to its satisfying completion. And they need enough materials, as we've just been talking about, to furnish a challenge and providing a feeling of sufficiency. So when we have unhurried and unstructured time, it means there's time to stop and look, to touch and listen or explore, and time to just be. And it could be like the image I've got here, a snail, making a silvery trail. And think about times where there might be opportunities for learning. It could be that you pull back the sandpit cover and you see a spider. Do you have a biocentric viewpoint of the value of all living organisms, where you might then say to the children, oh, look, let's move the spider by picking it up through a leaf to put in a safe place? Or do you get your foot and squash and squish it, or squish the snails in front of the children? So what is it that you do Do you use and see opportunities and recognise those moments to just be in the minute or in the moment for unhurried and unstructured time, to see them as learning moments? Let's look at the next slide. So the next slide is going to be really important to look at, because we're going to be looking at active, open and quiet spaces. So I ask you to think about your planning in relation to these and how you use loose materials and equipment in these spaces. You know, an active space might be where you might plan carpentry. It could be ball games or other spaces where there's lots of climbing and other equipment that it could be fixed. But open areas can be where you can use more flexible equipment to rearrange. It might be A-frames and planks that you can arrange in the way the children need them, but it also could be a space for ball games or games like What's the Time, Mr. Wolf, where the children need, you know, a lot of open area and a big group play. And often by fourth term, children, especially 4 to 5-year-olds, are really loving to be involved in group games. So open spaces where that might be able to be happening, but also in the way you arrange loose equipment and ladders and planks, etc., or tyres. And the quiet spaces, are there enough for children that might need a retreat space to go into? We know there's the fact that children have a biological need to be sometimes away from adults, you know, in quiet little retreat spaces. So we sometimes do need to plan them. And you might have a centre where, as I said before, you could get the pruners and create a spot behind bushes and things that becomes part of imaginative play. But think about spaces where there can be larger and smaller areas to maximise interaction, cooperation, collaboration, participation, concentration, investigation, all of the types of play that you know children love to be involved in. So that's a good theory, or these areas of theories are really important to look at as staff when you look and examine your environments. Are there active, open and quiet spaces for children? And most importantly also is how you have effective supervision. How do staff discuss, you know, where ratios will need to, or how ratios will be when you are in these spaces? Are staff able to scan and have a good line of vision of everything that's going on? Are there some children that may present with more challenging behaviours where you'll need an adult to have a bit more one-on-one time with that particular child until you know, everything is going well, that you can move away? These are really important things. So you need to use a sight for vision, a line of sight for vision, and staff allocation in the way you are in these spaces with children. Next. I know we've got a lot of material here. I might have to move through a bit quickly. So allowing time for exploration with flexible routines, taking children's particular needs, skills and interests into account, and less is best as a good guide, because, you know, sometimes when you have far too much out in equipment, you're either stressed at pack away time, or it becomes a real issue because children may be so overwhelmed and stimulated they're not really using all those loose materials in the best way. So I suggest you start small and keep building up as children have used them appropriately. And sometimes there needs to be intentional teaching in the correct and appropriate use of some materials. But I can remember in my early days of teaching sometimes far too much equipment out in a home corner, for example, and you find they've all left it and it's just one big mess. So less is best is a good guide. And children will make the space their own eventually. in the way they want to play there. So making sure that there's plenty of access to materials, to tools and props. And I do hope some of the photos you're seeing in today's session are inspiring in the way you see that you can set up play spaces. We'll move on. 1 hour goes quick. Feel free to add in anything too, Bron, if you see something that prompts you, because I know you're directly working at the moment with children. So play and learning, we need to also think very carefully about what the learning is when we're designing these play spaces. We need to be intentional in understanding what will the learning outcomes be, and then notice, recognise and respond in what you see is happening, and be able to articulate the learning happening in these spaces. So exploration will be happening where there's opportunities for children to learn about how things work. You know, they get opportunities for understanding cause and effect and trial and error, investigating the property of materials, and again for imaginative play in the way they use them. So we'll go to the next, because I do want some time for questions.
And I'm just wondering whether there might be an opportunity if people wanted to put some questions into the chat now. We might, if there's something that is really important that you wanted to share out of the remaining slides, and then we might open it up for questions, and some might be able to stay on a little bit longer over 5 o'clock if they wanted to as well.
Yes, that's fine by me. Yep.
Great.
So spontaneous sciencing, that could be another thing to really think about in teacher-led exploration, so that you use opportunities before, as I talked about, being in the moment. You know, a bird that you spot in a nest, for example, and the unplanned events inside or outside, being tuned in to what's going on around you. Or do you sometimes think, right, no, that's not on my plan today? So we need to think about those spontaneous experiences that can lead to a myriad of ideas. And sometimes these spontaneous learning experiences that just come on the day end up becoming projects for weeks or months at a time. And, you know, they go on for long periods of time and become really significant learning opportunities. So if we've got some questions coming on, or I think the next slide was a little bit about gardening. Maybe we can just flick through some of the images even. So this is number 4 of the theory from that earlier slide we were looking at. And again, you can use in-the-moment opportunities for prevailing and seasonal weather conditions. So there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing. I'm sure you've heard of that before. Making sure you've got hats and clothing accessible for children in different weather conditions, your Sun Smart policy in place, and relaxed routines rather than rigid. I always remember Doug Fargar from Westgarth Kindergarten, his bush kindergarten program, talking about a really significant learning time when children were hearing the sound of water, and it was after a heavy night of rain. Thank goodness we're in Victoria at the moment. It does make us think about the dreadful floods going on in New South Wales and Queensland. But the children were hearing water, and therefore they went beyond the boundary of the bush kindergarten program to investigate where it was coming from. And of course the creek was overflowing and, you know, faster currents of water. So, you know, he was using that as an example of in the moment and the source of sound for children in how they could use it as a learning opportunity. This top photo was taken when I worked at Gowrie, and the educators were really resourceful. Then there was a drought, of course, and a big tap was put underneath a big tree and made into a mud mud patch for children, so at the same time it was watering the tree. Yes, we can move on.
We did have one question in the chat, and that we might quickly answer just before 5. What behaviours, actions could we likely see if these initiatives, ideas are not being implemented?
What a wonderful question. I think you would go back firstly and look at your philosophy. And that's why I started with that thought, is it reflected in the philosophy? If it's written there, well, it's time to review it, and perhaps when you do your quality improvement plan, there needs to be staff discussion. And it depends who's asking, is the management needing to take a bit more responsibility? Is there an educational leader in the service that might be able to instigate it? And leaders aren't necessarily in the educational leader role. Sometimes one staff member could be inspirational in the way they lead other people to question it. But, a staff discussion might be the place to start. What would you think, Bron? You experienced this before?
Yes, and Karen, was it also about children's behaviour as well?
Oh, okay. Yes. So was that part of the question
Yes.
that I've missed?
Yep, it was.
Could you read the question again? Thank you.
Yes, I can. What behaviours, actions could we likely see if these initiatives are not implemented?
Okay, I saw that more as the staffing. So where was the child?
And actually, Andre has answered from a child's perspective of what you could see of, perhaps irritability, distractibility, difficulty in self-regulating, emotions. It's great to see the connections and networking in there.
Oh, okay, thank you. So I haven't got the comments part turned on where I'm seeing that. Well, I guess you need to look at inclusion in the way the play spaces are set up, and if they're catering for children with additional needs as well. So that would be one thing to be...
Also indoors, and too, I think if children spend a lot of time indoors and are all of a sudden just let out to the outdoor space, there can be a lot of running, and children actually need time to settle. So sometimes I think educators worry that it could be really robust and physical time that the children have outdoors. But if it's something that you do each and every day in an authentic indoor-outdoor space, then children have time to settle and engage with the experiences there, and therefore you'll see behaviours change. And, as that wonderful educator said, that building of resilience comes from being able to be outside. So that's the risk of not allowing children enough outdoor time.
Yes.
Is you're not
and
building resilience.
A good point about that, I always noticed and observed, and heard other people say this too, that often it took about 3/4 of an hour of outdoor play before children settled. And if you've only devoted that amount of time, you're just taking them in when, some children were just starting to unwind and settle. So that is an important point to take note of in how much time is there for outside, and maybe a group meeting before you go outside. You can help children focus on what they're about to go and play, what their interests are, or, a child might need something particular from the shed or the prop box to be using if they're extending their indoor play to outdoors. I remember Yarralea Street Kindergarten, where I was very fortunate in Elphington to be a student way back in the 70s, but Janet McLean had a focus on storying for children. And she used to talk about the children would maybe write a story and they acted out their story, and that often went from indoors to outdoors. So that play they're involved in creating the story in the indoor play, overflowed into outdoors. So that means the teacher needs to facilitate, how that play might be extended in the outdoors as well. So I hope those points help that person's question.
We did have one more question, and we are running 5 minutes late, but it's so wonderful to have the expertise online here, and we don't want you to miss out on hearing answers to the questions. So we might just take this one other question.
Yeah.
Critical point for using children's voice and child-led opportunities for teaching staff to enable play. How do teaching staff enable parents to do this as well?
Well, I guess it's really important to have dynamic discussions with parents and keep a regular flow of communication between them. That can flow back into how do you disperse children at the end of the day? Do you get a chance to be at the door to talk about the interests of the child? Do you get to say, how was your weekend? You know, what were your children interested in? So the parent might share something about the weekend that you can say, oh, like I often use an example where you might ask a parent or a family, oh, what did you do on the weekend? They might say, oh, we went to the Werribee Zoo. So immediately, I might be able to add some zoo figurines to the outdoor sand pit or extend on that child's experience that they've had with their family in the outdoor play, or using a communication book where parents can share such things. So that will often start with a relationship with a family to be able to extend on the child's voice in that way. Or have a wondering wall. I used to love that on a big whiteboard, a wondering wall where you have questions where parents might say, ask a question. My child's been asking, do goldfish breathe underwater, or whatever it may be, somewhere where, it's a shared community question. And I remember having a whiteboard once where a parent had asked a question that their child had asked at home and the parent wasn't sure. And the next day, a couple of parents came in after internet Google searches and they provided all the information that supported staff to extend on that. So relationships, opportunities for communication. Maybe Bron's got something that she could add in what happens in your own service at the moment.
Well, I think with the pandemic, sometimes it's been a bit tricky, particularly when we've had bouts of online learning. But I think what we've learned as educators is that we have a whole toolbox now of ways we can communicate with families, particularly if you're working with very young children and you're doing that quick exchange at the door. I do say, Anne, the most important thing is that face-to-face, if you can get it, or checking in with families, and particularly families that may not be as upfront as others. I mean, we have parents that are introverted as well, so looking at those families too, and if it's a family that perhaps you haven't touched base with in a while, to intentionally make time and space for those families as well. I've just found that a very introverted parent is actually a studier of bees, so that is particularly interesting to us, but something that she hadn't offered up front. So making space for all parents, and you've given wonderful suggestions, and it's just about working out what's working best for your parent cohort at the time, I think.
Yes, and I think it's okay, at perhaps a circle time or a mat time if you have them, and there's no one right way to have group time. Some people may not, but in your relationships with children, asking what might you need or like to learn. So you've got the child's voice. They might ask, or tell you there's something particular that they have of interest that you can support. So think about the child and the conversations. Make sure they're meaningful.
Now, both Anne and Bron, you know how stretched early childhood educators' time is, and we are running over time. But it's just been such a wonderful opportunity to listen to such passionate advocates for outdoor play, and we're just so very grateful, Anne, for your incredible expertise and knowledge and experience, and I think we should all be very aware how lucky we are to have this opportunity to spend time with Anne and Bron in this series, and we will ask you back, Anne, to continue and for another session one time in term 2 for sure.
Thank you. And maybe we can just finish with that conclusion
yes,
slide,
please do.
because that perhaps is positive for people that might be thinking, how am I going to do all of this? Or there might be things they are doing, but others things they'd still like to do.
So I've got the conclusion, acknowledge your process.
Yes, that's the one.
Yes. It's up on, it should be up on screen.
I can see it down the bottom of mine. I'm only seeing you, Bron.
Oh, I'm only seeing
Let me-
and I can see the conclusion. So it's certainly acknowledging your process, celebrating your
Oh,
achievements.
there, yes.
Yeah, noticing.
Yes, so yep, celebrate your achievements. Notice the shifts in thinking as you start to embed any new practices. Notice how the children become influenced, and document the positive, significant learning. But most importantly, accept that it's an ongoing process with the spaces ever evolving, and baby steps along the way are sometimes best in the way that you start. Thanks for listening, everybody, and to Karen and Bron for your assistance today too.
Thank you so much, Anne. And just a reminder to everyone that we will be sending out a copy of the recording from today, and so that'll be sent to you tomorrow. And we're hoping that you can all come along again next week. Actually, it's not next week. My apologies. It is in 2 weeks' time. It's actually on Monday, the 21st of March next time. And you'll be hearing from it's called The Habitat of Childhood, a snapshot. Snapchat, I'm one of those kids now, a snapshot of why spending time in and with nature is a fundamental component of childhood. And that's been brought to us by Jason, who is the General Manager of Nature Play SA. So a great opportunity. He has a background in ecology, conservation and community development. He wants to talk to you about what free play and what's often misassociated with nature play. So a great opportunity to hear from more passionate advocates and experts in the field. So thank you, everybody. Go to our website, look under Training NPD, and you'll find all of the information for the Early Years series. Again, Anne, thank you so much, and thank you, Bron, very much for your inclusion and very pertinent inclusion. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next week. No, I said it again.
Bye,
I'll
everyone.
see you on Monday, the 21st of March.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye.